crash, a UPS cargo jet seconds after takeoff from Louisville, Kentucky. At least 12 people killed, including all 3 on board, 9 people on the ground, including a child.
On November 4th, 2025, the sound of alarms filled the cockpit of a UPS cargo jet waiting to depart from Louisville. Thick smoke began to rise from its left wing as the MD-11 prepared for a 4,300-mile flight to Hawaii. Within seconds of liftoff, the aircraft's left engine exploded, and what began as a routine delivery turned into chaos. 3 crew members and thousands of gallons of fuel were suddenly caught in a chain of events that no one could stop. In less than 1 minute, a city that lived by the rhythm of its airport was pulled into disaster. This was more than an accident. It was a sign that the system itself was under strain. How could a simple takeoff become the deadliest cargo crash in U.S. history? At 5:13 p.m., UPS Flight 2976 began its takeoff roll on runway 17R at Louisville International Airport. The ground crew watched as the massive MD-11 roared forward, its engines pushing nearly 200 tons of steel and cargo into motion. Inside the cockpit, the pilots followed their checklist with precision, accelerating through 100 knots, then 150, and finally pulling back the control column as the nose lifted from the ground. For a few seconds, everything looked normal. But just moments after liftoff, fire erupted from the left engine. Witnesses later described it as a torch in the sky, a line of flames stretching behind the wing as the aircraft climbed. Video footage confirmed what they saw: the fire started before the wheels even left the ground. That meant the failure had already begun while the plane was still speeding down the runway. In less than 10 seconds, the situation turned from routine to catastrophic. The MD-11 managed to rise only 175 feet above the ground, barely higher than a 15-story building. Its speed peaked at 186 knots, or about 214 miles per hour, which was enough to get airborne but not enough to stabilize flight. Then the asymmetric thrust took over. With one engine producing full power and the other burning out, the aircraft began to twist uncontrollably. The pilots fought the yoke, trying to balance the rolling motion, but the fire was spreading fast. Inside the left wing, fuel lines and hydraulic systems were failing one by one. Suddenly, the burning engine detached completely from the wing. Photographers later found it lying in the grass near the runway, separated by hundreds of feet from the main wreckage. Without the left engine, the aircraft lost all control. It tilted sharply to the left, rolled over, and plunged toward the industrial zone bordering the airport. In the control tower, air traffic controllers could only watch as the radar signal disappeared from their screens. The entire sequence from liftoff to impact lasted less than 60 seconds. What made this disaster even worse was the timing. The plane was fully fueled for a 4,300-mile trip to Hawaii, carrying 38,000 gallons of jet fuel. That meant the crash would not only destroy the aircraft, but also ignite an inferno on the ground. In the following minutes, the sound of explosions echoed across Louisville as the fire consumed everything in its path. Rescue units rushed toward the smoke, not yet realizing that the blaze they were heading into was fueled by an ocean of burning jet fuel. Flight 2976 never had a real chance. The crew had only a few seconds to decide whether to abort or continue, but by the time the flames erupted, the aircraft was already beyond the safe point to stop. Their only option was to try to climb, hoping to gain enough altitude to circle back for an emergency landing. That hope vanished when the left engine broke apart. In that instant, control was lost forever. Louisville's evening sky turned red as burning fragments rained down on the city. Within moments, a routine cargo flight had become one of the most terrifying aviation disasters in recent memory. And yet, the real nightmare was still waiting below. What happened after the impact would turn an air accident into a full-scale urban catastrophe. So what did the people on the ground see when Flight 2976 fell from the sky? When Flight 2976 hit the ground, the impact was like an explosion tearing through the heart of an industrial zone. The MD-11F, loaded with 38,000 gallons of jet fuel, slammed into a cluster of warehouses and parking lots near the airport. A split second later, the fuel ignited, and a wall of fire rose into the sky. The blast shook nearby buildings, shattered windows, and sent burning debris flying across the area. The first structure to be hit was a petroleum recycling facility filled with tanks of used oil and fuel products. The second was an auto scrapyard stacked with metal parts and vehicles. Together, they created the perfect storm for a chain of explosions that would rage for hours. Workers who had been finishing their shifts were caught in the firestorm, unable to escape the sudden wave of heat and smoke. Within minutes, black smoke covered the horizon, visible from miles away. The night sky glowed orange as if the city itself had been set on fire. Emergency teams arrived within minutes, but what they found was chaos. Flames were spreading faster than they could control, fed by jet fuel, oil, and chemicals. The heat was so intense that firefighters could not approach the main wreckage. They fought from a distance, spraying foam and water while explosions echoed in the background. For those first responders, it felt like trying to fight a volcano with a garden hose. The scale of destruction forced city officials to issue a lockdown. Everyone within 5 miles of the airport was ordered to stay indoors to avoid breathing the toxic air. The restriction was later reduced to 1 mile, but by then, large parts of the city had already shut down. Power flickered, traffic stopped, and neighborhoods near the airport were engulfed in fear and silence. What had started as a single aircraft emergency had now turned into a full-scale disaster. By the time the fire began to cool, at least 12 people were confirmed dead, 15 more were injured, and 16 families still reported loved ones missing. The crash didn't just take lives in the sky, it took them on the ground, in homes and in workplaces that had nothing to do with aviation. It was a tragedy that erased the line between an air accident and an urban catastrophe. But as firefighters battled the flames, investigators faced a chilling mystery. Why had there been no Mayday call before the crash? When the tower lost contact with UPS Flight 2976, nobody realized they were listening to silence that would soon define the entire investigation. Normally, when a plane faces an emergency, pilots call out with a single word, Mayday, Mayday. That call triggers a wave of responses, clearing runways and alerting rescue teams. But on that November evening, not a single word made it through. Controllers at Louisville kept trying to reach the crew, yet every transmission came back buried in static. At first, the interference sounded like background noise, a faint hiss mixed with crackles. Then it became a wall of distortion, blocking any clear communication. Experts later said the radio feed was so corrupted that even advanced filters couldn't recover human speech. It was as if the crew was shouting into a void. Some believed they were trying to describe the fire, to declare an emergency, but whatever they said was swallowed by noise. This kind of total radio failure is rare, especially during takeoff. Most aircraft have redundant systems that allow them to switch to backup channels instantly, so investigators began asking why the communication vanished completely at the same moment the engine caught fire. One theory suggested that the blaze melted electrical wiring in the left wing, shorting out the antennas and power units. Another pointed to electromagnetic interference caused by the burning engine's components, creating a surge that jammed the radio frequencies. Whatever the reason, the timing could not have been worse. Without communication, the control tower couldn't warn other aircraft or deploy emergency vehicles onto the runway. Every second of silence cost the crew a chance to survive. Had the tower heard their distress, firefighters could have rushed to the end of runway 17R before the crash. But they didn't even know what had happened until they saw the fireball rise from behind the hangars. By then, it was already too late. For investigators, this loss of contact created one of the hardest challenges in aviation forensics. The cockpit voice recorder might capture the pilot's final words, but without air traffic audio, half the story was missing. It left a dark gap between what the crew experienced and what the world outside understood. That gap forced the National Transportation Safety Board to rely entirely on data logs, radar readings, and witness accounts. The emotional weight of those missing seconds hung over every part of the investigation. No one could shake the thought that those voices, trapped behind static, might have held the key to what went wrong. As the night turned to morning, the control tower replayed the same recordings again and again, hoping to hear even one clear word. All they found was silence and static. And in that silence, Louisville realized this was more than a crash. It was a communication breakdown that turned tragedy into catastrophe. If the radios failed so suddenly, what else on that 34-year-old aircraft might have been close to failure too? The aircraft at the center of the Louisville disaster was no ordinary cargo plane. It was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, a model that had already lived a long and complicated life. Built in 1991, it first served Thai Airways as a passenger jet before being purchased and converted by UPS in 2006. For more than 3 decades, it crossed oceans and continents, logging tens of thousands of flight hours and carrying millions of pounds of freight. But with age comes fatigue, and for an aircraft, that fatigue hides deep inside its metal skin. Every takeoff and landing puts enormous stress on the wings, engines, and fuselage. Tiny cracks form, invisible to the naked eye, and slowly spread over time. That is why older planes demand strict maintenance schedules and detailed inspections. Yet, as investigators began studying Flight 2976, they found that this MD-11's left engine had already been repaired several times in the past decade. One maintenance record from 2019 mentioned the discovery of a small fatigue crack near the pylon, the structure that connects the engine to the wing. It had been welded and reinforced before the aircraft returned to service. But even the best repairs cannot completely erase the stress that decades of flight create. The MD-11 itself has a reputation for being both powerful and difficult to handle. Designed as an upgrade to the DC-10, it featured longer wings and advanced digital controls, but pilots often described it as unforgiving, especially during takeoff and landing. The plane's long fuselage and sensitive pitch control meant that even small mistakes could lead to dangerous instability. Over the years, multiple MD-11s have been involved in accidents linked to loss of control or structural failure, particularly during high-stress maneuvers. These incidents did not mean the plane was unsafe, but they did highlight how narrow its safety margins could be. By 2025, most passenger airlines had retired the MD-11 entirely. Only cargo operators like UPS and FedEx still use them, mainly because of their ability to carry heavy loads across long distances. However, converting old airliners into freighters also changes how weight and stress are distributed through the airframe. Each modification adds new pressure points and new risks that must be monitored closely. Investigators now suspect that the fatigue around the left engine pylon might have been a silent warning that went unnoticed. If that metal connection failed during takeoff, it could explain why the engine detached so suddenly. As the NTSB dug deeper, they started asking hard questions about maintenance oversight. Was the 2019 repair sufficient? Were follow-up inspections done with modern scanning tools like ultrasound or thermography? And if cracks were found, why wasn't the part replaced entirely? The answers could determine whether this was an unavoidable mechanical failure or a preventable lapse in maintenance. The MD-11 was built to last, but nothing lasts forever in aviation. Metal weakens, bolts loosen, and time always leaves its mark. Flight 2976 may have looked strong on the outside, but inside, something could have already been giving way. Could years of pressure, vibration, and overlooked fatigue have turned this once trusted aircraft into a ticking time bomb? Behind every flight, there is a network of people whose job is to keep planes safe. For UPS, that network stretches across hundreds of maintenance bases and thousands of mechanics who inspect, test, and repair aircraft every day. But when an airline moves hundreds of tons of cargo around the world in a single night, the pressure to keep everything running on schedule can be enormous. And that pressure, experts say, may have played a hidden role in the tragedy of Flight 2976. Cargo airlines like UPS operate differently from passenger carriers. Their business runs on speed, precision, and volume. At the company's Worldport hub in Louisville, a new plane lands every minute during the night shift. Packages are unloaded, sorted, and reloaded onto waiting aircraft within hours. Each minute a plane sits idle costs money, and delays can throw off delivery chains across the country. That intense pace leaves little room for error and even less time for maintenance crews to catch up. The MD-11 fleet is among the oldest in UPS's inventory, which means it requires more frequent inspections than newer models. According to aviation records, maintenance for these aircraft often involves checking thousands of components, from fuel lines to control systems. Each inspection can take days, but tight schedules often force airlines to plan shorter maintenance windows. Small fixes might be postponed or deferred to keep flights moving. These decisions are not careless, but they build up risk over time. It is a trade-off every logistics giant faces: keep the world moving or stop to make sure every bolt is perfect. Investigators began comparing the Flight 2976 crash to past accidents involving aging cargo jets. In 2013, UPS Flight 1354 crashed in Birmingham, Alabama, after a series of procedural errors and system misjudgments. In 2009, FedEx Flight 80 went down in Japan when its MD-11 flipped during landing due to a combination of wind shear and design limits. Each event revealed a different weakness, but together they pointed to one uncomfortable truth: cargo operations run on thinner margins of safety. While passenger aircraft are subject to intense oversight and regular upgrades, freighters often continue flying far longer than intended. They carry goods instead of people, and that difference can subtly shift how risk is managed. UPS has one of the strongest safety records in the industry, but even the best systems can strain under constant demand. Investigators are now studying whether operational pressure affected maintenance schedules or inspection depth before the Louisville crash. Was the engine's previous repair properly tested under full load? Were the fatigue checks thorough, or were some areas skipped to save time? No one is suggesting neglect, but in aviation, even a small oversight can grow into a disaster. The system works until one part of it doesn't. The story of Flight 2976 is not just about one engine that failed, but about a structure stretched to its limits by speed, workload, and expectation. Every night, hundreds of planes just like it lift off, each carrying the promise of reliability that the world's commerce depends on. So when a single failure can shake that entire network, what does it say about the system built to keep our skies safe? The crash of UPS Flight 2976 didn't just end a flight, it brought an entire city to a standstill. Within minutes of the explosion, Louisville's skyline disappeared behind a thick curtain of smoke. Emergency sirens echoed through the streets, and police cars blocked every road leading to the airport. The city's heartbeat, usually driven by the constant rhythm of planes arriving and departing, went silent. For the first time in years, Worldport, the center of UPS's global network, shut down completely. Worldport isn't just another facility. It is the largest automated air cargo hub in the world, processing hundreds of flights and millions of packages every day. When it stopped, the ripple effect reached across the nation. Deliveries were delayed, schedules collapsed, and supply chains froze. But the cost to the community was far heavier than any lost shipment. Schools in Jefferson County were closed the following day, not because of physical damage, but because the city was in mourning. Some students had parents who worked at the crash site, and others still didn't know if their loved ones had survived. As night turned to dawn, over 100 firefighters remained on the ground, battling the last pockets of flame. The air smelled of burnt metal and jet fuel, and the ground was covered in a layer of ash. Residents were told to keep their windows shut as toxic fumes drifted through the neighborhoods. Inside emergency shelters, families waited for news that often never came. At a reunification center near the police training academy, volunteers handed out blankets and food while investigators quietly collected DNA samples to identify victims. The city that had once symbolized precision logistics was now struggling to breathe through grief and disbelief. In those first 24 hours, Louisville became more than just the site of an aviation accident. It became a reminder of how deeply connected modern life is to flight. When one plane goes down, it doesn't just destroy metal and cargo, it halts routines, separates families, and reshapes an entire community's sense of safety. Local news stations aired interviews with witnesses who said the ground shook like an earthquake. Hospitals were overwhelmed with burn victims, while firefighters rotated in shifts, too exhausted to speak. The mayor called it the darkest day in Louisville's modern history. Yet even amid the devastation, questions lingered. What caused the engine to fail so suddenly? Could the disaster have been prevented before that night? As the fires cooled and the search teams finished their grim work, investigators prepared to uncover what had gone wrong inside that aircraft. What they found next would reveal a chain of failures more complex than anyone expected. The investigation into Flight 2976 began before the fire was even out. Within hours, a team from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived in Louisville, joined by specialists from the Federal Aviation Administration and UPS's own safety division. They set up command posts near the crash site, marking off debris with colored flags and documenting every fragment. Each piece of wreckage told part of the story: the twisted metal of the wing, the engine that had separated, and the scorched fragments of the fuselage scattered across the industrial park. Investigators worked through the night collecting data from the flight recorders, which were found partially buried beneath layers of ash and melted aluminum. One contained engine performance readings, while the other held the final cockpit conversations. The data showed that the left engine began losing pressure seconds before takeoff, followed by a sharp spike in temperature. Then, power readings dropped suddenly, confirming a total mechanical failure. But the cause of that failure was not yet clear. Had a part inside the turbine fractured, or had a fuel line burst into flame? To find out, engineers began reconstructing the broken engine in a lab, piece by piece, as if solving a giant mechanical puzzle. Meanwhile, another part of the team focused on maintenance records. They traced the aircraft's history back to its last inspection and every repair done in the years before the crash. Early findings revealed that the same left engine had been serviced multiple times for vibration issues. Although it passed safety tests after each repair, no one could confirm whether ultrasonic scans had been performed to detect internal cracks. If those scans were skipped, the smallest flaw might have grown unnoticed until it tore the metal apart. The NTSB also examined the loss of radio contact. They found burn marks along the communication wiring, suggesting that the fire might have shorted out electrical systems even before takeoff. Combined with the engine failure, it created a perfect storm that left the pilots with no power, no communication, and no time. As one investigator later said, everything that could fail did, and it happened faster than anyone could react. By the end of the first week, the team concluded that the crash was not caused by one single mistake, but by a chain of events. A mechanical fault triggered the fire, maintenance gaps allowed the problem to grow, and the communication loss sealed the crew's fate. Each link in that chain might have seemed small on its own, but together they created a tragedy that no one could stop. The final report could take a year or more, but the message was already clear. If one failure can ignite another, how many more flights are flying with hidden cracks waiting to be found? UPS Flight 2976 lasted less than a minute in the air, but its impact will echo for years. It exposed how fragile the balance between speed and safety can be in modern aviation. When schedules outweigh inspections, even the smallest crack can bring down a giant of steel. The tragedy in Louisville is a warning that maintenance, training, and oversight must evolve before history repeats itself. Every flight we trust begins with people who believe the system will hold. But will it always? Was this disaster a random failure, or proof that our skies are aging faster than we think? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more investigations like this.